The dusty streets of Millbrook buzzed with unusual excitement as the morning Stagecoach prepared for its weekly journey to Silver Creek. Jake Morrison adjusted his worn leather hat and checked his pocket watch, the brass surface catching the early sunlight. 28. He had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable ranch hands in the territory. He was known for his punctuality and unwavering determination to keep his word. The stagecoach sat heavy with cargo and passengers, its wooden wheels creaking under the weight. Jake had promised his boss, Mr. Henderson, that he would deliver important cattle contracts to the buyers in Silver Creek by noon. The documents were crucial for the ranch's survival through the harsh winter months ahead, and Jake took his responsibility seriously. As he approached the stagecoach, a young woman suddenly appeared beside him. She couldn't have been more than 22, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and worried green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Her simple blue dress was clean, but showed signs of frequent mending, suggesting she wasn't from one of the wealthy families in town. "Please, sir," she said urgently, grabbing Jake's arm with surprising strength. "Don't get in that stagecoach. Something terrible is going to happen." Jake paused, studying her face. There was genuine fear in her expression, but he had never seen her before in Millbrook. Strangers often passed through the town, but few stayed long enough to make an impression. Her grip on his arm trembled slightly, and he could see beads of perspiration on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "Miss, I appreciate your concern," Jake replied politely, gently removing her hand from his arm. But I have important business in Silver Creek. The stagecoach is the fastest way to get there." The young woman's eyes widened with desperation. "You don't understand. I've seen what happens. The bridge over Canyon Creek is damaged from the recent storms. The stagecoach is too heavy, and it won't hold. People will get hurt, maybe even killed." Jake frowned, considering her words. The autumn rains had been particularly heavy this year, and he had heard reports of flooding in various parts of the territory. However, the stagecoach company would surely have checked the route before allowing passengers to board. They had a reputation to maintain and couldn't afford accidents. "How do you know about the bridge?" Jake asked, his tone becoming more serious. "Are you from Canyon Creek?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the busy street. "I traveled this route yesterday. I saw the damage with my own eyes. The wooden supports are cracked and the metal fixtures are loose. It's not safe for anything heavier than a single horse." Jake studied her more carefully. Her boots were muddy, and her dress showed signs of recent travel. She could be telling the truth about making the journey, but something in her manner suggested she was holding back information. Perhaps she was simply a worried traveler who had witnessed the bridge's condition. "If the bridge is truly dangerous, why haven't you reported it to the authorities?" Jake questioned. "Sheriff Williams would want to know about any hazards on the main route." The woman's face flushed, and she looked down at her hands. I tried, but no one would listen to me. They said I was just a frightened woman who didn't understand construction. They dismissed my concerns without even investigating." Jake felt a pang of sympathy. He had witnessed similar situations where women's voices were ignored simply because of their gender. However, he also knew that panic and fear could sometimes make people imagine dangers that didn't exist. The stagecoach company had been operating this route for over 15 years without any major incidents. "Miss, I understand your worry," Jake said gently, "but I have a responsibility to my employer and the people depending on these contracts. If I don't make this delivery, several families might lose their livelihoods." 8. The driver of the stagecoach, old Pete, called out impatiently. "All aboard. We're already running behind schedule. If you're coming, get on now." Jake tipped his hat to the young woman. "I appreciate your warning, but I must go. Perhaps you could speak with the sheriff again. Provide more details about what you observed." As he climbed into the stagecoach, he heard her voice one last time, filled with anguish. "Please, I'm begging you, don't go. You've no idea what you're walking into." Jake settled into his seat, placing his leather satchel containing the contracts beside him. The other passengers included a middle-aged merchant, an elderly couple traveling to visit their daughter, a young man who appeared to be a traveling salesman. They all seemed excited about the journey, chatting about their destinations and plans. as the stagecoach lurched forward and began its journey out of Millbrook. Jake found himself thinking about the mysterious young woman. Her fear had seemed genuine, and her knowledge of the route suggested she had indeed traveled it recently. However, he reminded himself that people often exaggerated dangers, especially when they had experienced something frightening. The morning sun climbed higher as they traveled through the familiar countryside. Jake had made this journey dozens of times and knew every landmark along the way. The rolling hills covered with autumn grass, the scattered oak trees beginning to change color, and the distant mountains creating a beautiful backdrop for the journey. About an hour into the trip, Jake began to notice that old Pete seemed more cautious than usual. The driver was taking the curves more slowly and appeared to be studying the road ahead more carefully. When Jake mentioned this to the merchant sitting across from him, the man shrugged and suggested that Pete was simply being careful due to the recent weather conditions. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Jake found his thoughts returning to the young woman's urgent plea. Something about her desperation had felt authentic, and he wondered if he should have taken her warning more seriously. However, it was too late now to turn back, and he had made a commitment that he intended to honor. The stagecoach continued its steady progress toward Canyon Creek, unaware of the fate that awaited them at the damaged bridge ahead. The stagecoach rolled steadily through the countryside, its wheels crunching over the dirt road that had been softened by recent rains. Jake tried to focus on the scenery passing by his window, but the young woman's desperate words kept echoing in his mind. Her fear had been so real, so urgent, that it was difficult to dismiss completely. Old Pete guided the horses with practiced ease, his weathered hands steady on the reins. He had been driving this route for nearly 20 years and knew every rock, every turn, and every potential hazard. The passengers inside the coach chatted quietly among themselves, sharing stories of their destinations and the business that awaited them in Silver Creek as they approached a familiar bend in the road. Jake noticed something unusual. Fresh horse tracks led off the main path toward a cluster of trees, and there appeared to be recent camping signs in the area. Broken branches and trampled grass suggested that several people had been there recently, possibly within the last day or two. The merchant across from Jake, a stout man named Mr. Whitmore, noticed Jake's attention to the landscape. "You seem troubled, young man. Is something bothering you about our journey?" Jake hesitated before responding. "A woman in town warned me not to take this stagecoach. She claimed the bridge over Canyon Creek was damaged from the storms." Mr. Whitmore chuckled and adjusted his spectacles. "Ah, the worries of the fairer sex. They often see dangers where none exist, especially after hearing gossip from other travelers. I've been making business trips on this route for 5 years, and I've never encountered any serious problems." The elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, overheard the conversation. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward with interest. "What did this young woman look like, if you don't mind my asking?" Jake described the auburn-haired woman with green eyes, mentioning her simple blue dress and the urgency in her voice. As he spoke, he noticed a strange expression cross Mrs. Patterson's face, as if she recognized the description. "Henry," Mrs. Patterson whispered to her husband, "doesn't that sound like the Miller girl we heard about?" Mr. Patterson nodded slowly, his expression growing serious. "Indeed it does, Martha. The one who lost her family in that terrible accident last month." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What accident?" Mrs. Patterson glanced nervously at her husband before continuing. "There was a young woman named Sarah Miller whose family was traveling to visit relatives in Silver Creek. Their wagon hit a weak spot on a wooden bridge, and it collapsed. Her parents and younger brother didn't survive the fall into the creek below. The poor girl has been beside herself ever since," Mr. Patterson added quietly. "Some say the tragedy affected her mind. She's been telling anyone who will listen that bridges are dangerous, that people shouldn't travel the main routes." Jake felt his stomach tighten. The woman's desperate pleas suddenly took on a different meaning. If she had recently lost her family in a bridge collapse, her fear of the Canyon Creek Bridge might be based on trauma rather than actual current damage. Her warning could be the result of her grief and fear rather than genuine danger. However, something still bothered him about dismissing her concerns entirely. The mud on her boots and the travel-worn appearance of her dress suggested she had Indeed, been on the road recently. Perhaps she had actually seen something at the bridge. Maybe her traumatic experience had made her more observant of potential structural problems that others might overlook. The young traveling salesman had been quietly listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. I heard similar stories when I was in Canyon Creek 2 weeks ago. Some of the locals mentioned that the bridge has been making unusual sounds, creaking more than normal when wagons cross. Old Pete's voice called down from the driver's seat, interrupting their discussion. We're approaching the descent toward Canyon Creek, folks. Should be crossing the bridge in about 15 minutes. Beautiful view from up there, especially with all the autumn colors. Jake moved closer to the window and peered ahead. In the distance, he could see the beginning of the canyon, where the road would wind down toward the creek and the wooden bridge that spanned the water. The recent rains had swollen the creek, and he could see the rushing water even from this distance. As they began the descent, the stagecoach swayed more noticeably on the uneven road. The extra weight from the cargo and passengers made the vehicle feel less stable than usual, and Jake found himself gripping the side of his seat during the sharper turns. Mr. Whitmore noticed Jake's tension. First time traveling this route, the descent can be a bit unsettling, but old Pete knows what he's doing. We'll be across that bridge and climbing the other side before you know it. Jake tried to relax, but something felt different about this journey. Maybe it was the woman's warning, or perhaps it was the story about her family's tragedy. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into danger. The stagecoach seemed heavier than usual, and the road appeared more rutted and unstable than he remembered from previous trips. As they rounded another bend, the bridge came into full view. It was a substantial wooden structure built to handle regular wagon traffic and designed to last for many years. However, from this angle and distance, Jake couldn't see any obvious signs of damage or structural problems. The creek below rushed with dark water, swollen from the recent rains and moving faster than usual. If there were any problems with the bridge, the consequences could be severe.
Ow.
The drop to the creek was at least 20 feet, and the rocks visible along the banks looked sharp and unforgiving. Old Pete called out again, his voice carrying a note of caution that hadn't been there earlier. Hold on tight, everyone. Bridge crossing coming up. Creek's running high today. Jake noticed that Pete was slowing the horses more than usual as they approached the bridge. The drivers experienced I might have noticed something about the structure or the road conditions that made him more cautious. Or perhaps Pete had also heard rumors about potential problems with the bridge. The stagecoach rolled closer to the wooden structure, and Jake could now hear the rushing water below. The sound was louder than he remembered, suggesting that the creek was indeed much higher than normal. The wooden planks of the bridge came into clearer view, and Jake strained to see any signs of damage or weakness. As they approached the bridge entrance, Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite his growing unease and the mysterious woman's desperate warning, he remained silent. Trusting in the experience of old Pete and the reputation of the Stagecoach Company, the front wheels of the stagecoach rolled onto the wooden planks of the Canyon Creek Bridge with a hollow, thudding sound. Jake felt the subtle change in the vehicle's movement as it transitioned from the dirt road to the wooden surface. Clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoed differently now, creating an almost musical pattern against the rushing water below. Old Pete maintained his cautious pace, guiding the team of 4 horses with steady hands. The bridge stretched approximately 60 feet across the canyon, supported by thick wooden beams and reinforced with metal brackets that had been installed during the structure's construction 15 years earlier. As the stagecoach reached the quarter point of the bridge, Jake noticed a subtle vibration in the floorboards beneath his feet. At first, he attributed it to the normal movement of a heavily loaded vehicle crossing a wooden structure. However, the vibration seemed more pronounced. Then he remembered from previous crossings, Mrs. Patterson gripped her husband's arm tightly, her knuckles white with tension. "Henry, does something feel different about this crossing?" Before Mr. Patterson could respond, a sharp creaking sound echoed from somewhere beneath the stagecoach. The sound was distinctly different from the normal groans and squeaks of wooden planks under pressure. It had a sharp, almost splitting quality that sent a chill through Jake's spine. Mr. Whitmore attempted to maintain his earlier confidence, But Jake could see concern growing in his eyes, probably just the bridge settling under the weight. Structures are built to handle much more than one stagecoach. The young traveling salesman had gone pale and was gripping the side of his seat. He stared out the window at the rushing water below, his earlier conversation about the bridge's unusual sounds taking on a more ominous meaning as they approached the middle of the bridge. It's the halfway point of their crossing, another sound joined. The creaking. It was a grinding metallic noise that suggested something was shifting or breaking under the strain. Jake's heart began to beat faster as he realized that the mysterious woman's warning might have been based on genuine observation, rather than trauma-induced fear. Old Pete's voice carried back to them. But his tone had changed from casual confidence to growing concern. "Easy there, boys. Take it slow and steady." Jake could hear the tension in the driver's voice and knew that Pete was also sensing that something was wrong. The experienced driver was fighting to maintain control while dealing with an increasingly unstable situation. Suddenly, Stagecoach lurched slightly to the left, causing all the passengers to shift in their seats. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that something beneath them was giving way or shifting position. The grinding sound grew louder, and Jake could now distinguish what sounded like wood splintering under enormous pressure. "We need to get off this bridge," Jake said urgently, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter of the other passengers. Something is seriously wrong." Mr. Whitmore tried to maintain his composure, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Good nonsense. We're already halfway across. It would be more dangerous to try to back up now." As if responding to his words, another sharp crack echoed from beneath the bridge, followed immediately by a noticeable sagging sensation. The stagecoach tilted slightly more to the left, and Jake could see through his window that the bridge railing was no longer perfectly straight. Mrs. Patterson let out a small cry of fear, and her husband wrapped his arms around her protectively. The elderly couple had lived through many dangers in their long lives, but the helpless feeling of being trapped in a failing structure was terrifying. Jake made a quick decision. He moved toward the door of the stagecoach, preparing to call up to Old Pete, when the most alarming sound yet reached their ears. It was the unmistakable sound of a major support beam cracking under pressure, followed by the screech of metal brackets being pulled from their moorings. "Pete!" Jake shouted toward the driver's seat. "We need to get off this bridge immediately." Old Pete's response was immediate and filled with urgency. "Hold on tight, everyone. We're going to try to make it across, but something's giving way beneath us." The horses, sensing the danger through their driver's tension and the unstable footing, began to move faster despite Pete's attempts to maintain control. Their increased speed caused the stagecoach to bounce and sway more violently on the compromised bridge structure. With approximately 20 feet remaining to reach the far side of the bridge, disaster struck. A major support beam beneath the left side of the bridge finally succumbed to the combined stress of the heavy load and the structural damage from the recent storms. The sound of splitting wood and screaming metal filled the air as that section of the bridge began to collapse. The stagecoach tilted sharply to the left, throwing all the passengers against that side of the vehicle. Jake found himself pressed against Mr. Whitmore, while Mrs. Patterson screamed in terror as she and her husband slid across their seat. Old Pete fought desperately to control the horses, urging them forward toward the remaining stable section of the bridge. The front wheels were still on solid planking, but the rear of the stagecoach was beginning to sink as the bridge structure failed beneath it. "Jump!" Pete yelled back to the passengers. "If you can get out, jump toward the right side of the bridge." Jake struggled against the tilting floor and managed to reach the door handle. As he pushed the door open, he could see the rushing water of Canyon Creek far below, its dark surface broken by white rapids and jagged rocks. The drop looked even more terrifying from this angle than it had from the approaching road. The young traveling salesman, driven by panic, pushed past Jake and leaped toward the right side of the bridge where some of the structure still appeared solid. He landed hard on the wooden planks, rolled several feet, and lay still. But Jake could see that he was breathing and conscious. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson were trapped on the lower side of the tilting stagecoach, unable to climb up toward the door. Against the steep angle, Mr. Whitmore was trying to help them, but the continuing collapse of the bridge made movement increasingly difficult. Jake faced a terrible decision. He could save himself by jumping to the possibly stable section of the bridge, or he could stay and try to help the elderly couple who were trapped in the sinking stagecoach. Every second of hesitation meant less chance of survival for everyone involved. The memory of the mysterious woman's desperate plea echoed in his mind as he realized the full magnitude of his mistake in ignoring her warning. Her knowledge had been real, her fear justified, and his decision to dismiss her concerns was about to cost lives. Jake made his choice in that split second of terror. Instead of jumping to safety, he braced himself against the doorframe and reached toward Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, who were sliding helplessly toward the lower side of the tilting stagecoach. The bridge continued to groan and collapse beneath them, metal brackets screaming as they tore loose from rotting wood. "Give me your hand," Jake shouted over the din of destruction, stretching as far as he could reach toward the elderly couple. The stagecoach lurched again, tilting at an even steeper angle as more of the bridge structure gave way. Mr. Patterson, showing remarkable presence of mind despite the chaos, managed to push his wife toward Jake's outstretched hand. "Take Martha first. I can hold on a bit longer." Mrs. Patterson, tears streaming down her face, reached desperately for Jake's hand. Their fingers touched just as another section of the bridge collapsed with a thunderous crack. The sudden drop caused Jake to lose his grip, and Mrs. Patterson slid further down into the stagecoach. Old Pete's voice carried back to them, filled with desperation and determination. "I'm going to try to get the horses to pull us onto solid ground. Hold on just a little longer." The brave driver was urging his team forward with everything he had, trying to use the horses' strength to drag the stagecoach across the remaining few feet of bridge before the entire structure collapsed. The animals, terrified but trained to respond to their master's commands, strained against their harnesses with superhuman effort. Jake could see that Mr. Whitmore had wedged himself against the upper side of the stagecoach and was trying to create a human chain to help the Pattersons. Despite his earlier dismissal of the danger, the merchant was now showing remarkable courage in the face of disaster. "Here," Whitmore called out, extending his hand toward Jake. "Use me as an anchor." Jake grabbed Whitmore's wrist and stretched even further down into the tilting coach. This time he managed to grasp Mrs. Patterson's wrist firmly. Her husband was trying to push her upward while maintaining his own precarious hold on a wooden seat that was beginning to crack under the stress. The front wheels of the stagecoach suddenly jolted forward as old Pete's desperate gamble began to pay off. The horses had managed to pull the front axle onto the stable section of the bridge on the far side of Canyon Creek. However, the rear of the vehicle was still suspended over the gap where the bridge had collapsed, held only by the connection to the front wheels and the strength of the stagecoach's frame. "We're almost there," Pete yelled back to them. "The horses are on solid ground. I just need to get the rest of us across." Jake felt hope surge through him as he maintained his grip on Mrs. Patterson. With Whitmore's help, he began pulling the elderly woman up toward the door of the stagecoach. She was heavier than he expected, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Mrs. Patterson's eyes met his as he pulled her towards safety, and he saw a mixture of gratitude and fear that would remain with him forever. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos around them, just as Jake managed to get Mrs. Patterson within reach of the door. Disaster struck again. The wooden frame of the stagecoach itself began to split under the enormous stress of being suspended between the collapsed bridge and the horses on solid ground. The vehicle was literally being torn apart by the opposing forces. A sharp crack echoed from somewhere beneath them, different from the sounds of the collapsing bridge. This was the sound of the stagecoach itself beginning to fail. Jake realized, with horror, that even if they reached the door, the vehicle might break apart before they could escape. Old Pete, sensing the critical moment, made one final, desperate attempt. He cracked his whip and urged the horses forward with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed. "Pull, boys. Pull like your lives depend on it." The horses responded magnificently, their hooves finding purchase on the solid ground beyond the bridge. Slowly, inch by inch, the stagecoach began to move forward. Jake could feel the angle of the floor beginning to level out slightly as more of the vehicle's weight shifted onto stable ground. However, their relief was short-lived. Mr. Patterson, who had been holding onto the wooden seat, suddenly cried out in pain. The seat had finally given way under the stress, and he was sliding helplessly toward the back of the stagecoach, where the floor was beginning to separate from the walls. Henry. Mrs. Patterson screamed, seeing her husband of 40 years sliding away from them toward what appeared to be certain death. Jake made another split-second decision that would haunt him forever. He could either continue pulling Mrs. Patterson to safety, or he could release her and try to save her husband. There wasn't time to do both, and every second of hesitation meant less chance of survival for everyone. The young traveling salesman, who had successfully jumped to the stable part of the bridge earlier, was now trying to help from outside the stagecoach. He had positioned himself near the door and was reaching in to help pull Mrs. Patterson out of the vehicle. "I've got her," the salesman shouted to Jake. "Go help the old man." Jake released Mrs. Patterson's wrist, trusting that the salesman and Whitmore could get her to safety, and threw himself down the tilting floor toward Mr. Patterson. The elderly man was struggling to maintain any grip as the back of the stagecoach continued to separate from the rest of the vehicle. The stagecoach lurched forward again as Old Pete's horses made another tremendous effort. Jake could see daylight appearing through cracks in the vehicle's frame, and he knew they had only moments before the entire structure came apart. He managed to grab Mr. Patterson's wrist just as the elderly man lost his final handhold. For a moment, Jake was supporting the full weight of another human being while the stagecoach disintegrated around them in Canyon Creek, rushed beneath them through the growing gaps in the floor. Time seemed to slow as Jake held Mr. Patterson's weight while the stagecoach disintegrated around them. Through the growing cracks in the floor, you could see the rushing waters of Canyon Creek 20 feet below, its dark surface dotted with jagged rocks that would show no mercy to anyone who fell. Old Pete's horses made one final heroic effort, their muscles straining as they pulled the remnants of the stagecoach across the last few feet of stable bridge. Jake felt the vehicle lurch forward again, and suddenly the angle of the floor began to level out as more of the stagecoach's frame reached solid ground. The young traveling salesman and Mr. Whitmore had successfully pulled Mrs. Patterson through the door and onto the stable section of the bridge. She was shaken but conscious, calling out desperately for her husband, who was still trapped in the collapsing rear of the vehicle. Jake summoned strength he didn't know he possessed and began pulling Mr. Patterson up toward the front of the stagecoach. The elderly man was heavier than his wife, and Jake's muscles burned with the effort of supporting another person's full weight while maintaining his own precarious position. "Hold on, sir," Jake grunted through clenched teeth. "We're almost there." Mr. Patterson's eyes showed a mixture of determination and resignation. Despite his fear, the old man was trying to help by using his free hand to grab onto anything that might provide support. However, the interior of the stagecoach was coming apart. With seats breaking loose and cargo shifting dangerously, Old Pete called back to them, his voice hoarse from shouting commands to his horses. "The front axle is on solid ground. I'm going to try to pull the whole thing forward, but the frame might not hold." As if responding to his warning, a loud crack echoed from beneath them. The connection between the front and rear sections of the stagecoach was beginning to fail. Jake realized with growing horror that the vehicle was literally being torn in half by the stress of the rescue attempt. The young salesman appeared at the door again, reaching down into the stagecoach. "Here, give me the old man's other hand." Jake managed to maneuver Mr. Patterson close enough for the salesman to grab his free wrist. Together, they began pulling the elderly man toward the door in safety. Mrs. Patterson was crying and praying. Outside the stagecoach, her hands clasped together as she watched the desperate rescue attempt. Just as they got Mr. Patterson within reach of the door, the inevitable happened. The wooden frame of the stagecoach finally gave way completely. With a tremendous crash, the rear section of the vehicle broke free and plunged toward Canyon Creek, taking with it all the cargo, luggage, and Jake's leather satchel containing the important cattle contracts The sudden release of weight caused the front section of the stagecoach to shoot forward onto solid ground with jarring force. Jake, the salesman, and Mr. Patterson were thrown together in a heap as the remaining portion of the vehicle came to rest on stable earth beyond the collapsed bridge. For several moments, everyone lay still, stunned by their survival and the sudden silence after the chaos of the collapse. The only sounds were the rushing water below, the heavy breathing of the exhausted horses, and Mrs. Patterson's sobs of relief as she saw her husband alive. Old Pete climbed down from his driver's seat, his face pale and his hands shaking. The experienced driver had seen many dangerous situations in his years on the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for the terror of watching his stagecoach literally fall apart beneath him while passengers' lives hung in the balance. "Is everyone alive?" Pete asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Please tell me nobody fell into that creek." Jake slowly got to his feet, checking himself for injuries. His arms and shoulders ached from the strain of holding Mr. Patterson's weight. He had numerous cuts and bruises from being thrown around inside the collapsing stagecoach. However, he was alive and functional. The young traveling salesman was conscious but appeared to have injured his leg during his earlier jump to the bridge. He was pale and shaking, probably from shock as much as physical trauma. Mr. Whitmore had emerged from the ordeal with minor cuts but was otherwise unharmed. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson were holding each other tightly, both crying with relief and gratitude. Despite their ordeal, they appeared to be physically uninjured, though the emotional trauma would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As Jake surveyed the scene, the full impact of their narrow escape began to sink in. The mysterious young woman's warning had been completely accurate. The bridge had indeed been damaged from the recent storms, and the weight of the loaded stagecoach had been too much for the compromised structure to bear. If he had listened to her plea, if he had taken her warning seriously instead of dismissing it, none of this would have happened. The bridge would have been inspected and repaired before anyone else attempted to cross it. The cargo would have been saved and nobody would have been injured or traumatized. Jake looked back at the remains of the bridge, where twisted metal and broken wood jutted out over the rushing water. Far below, he could see pieces of the stagecoach's rear sections scattered among the rocks, including his leather satchel with the contracts that were supposed to save the Henderson Ranch. The contracts were gone, lost forever in the creek below. Jake's mission had failed completely, and he had nearly gotten himself and 4 other people killed in the process. Worse yet, he knew that his failure to deliver the contracts would have serious consequences for the ranch and the families who depended on it for their livelihood. Old Pete walked over to Jake, his weathered face showing a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Son, I've been driving this route for 20 years and I've never seen anything like that. How did you know to help those folks instead of jumping to save yourself?" Jake looked at the old driver, then at the other survivors who were slowly recovering from their ordeal. "There was a young woman in Millbrook who tried to warn me about the bridge. I didn't listen to her. I thought she was just frightened or confused." The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical burden. Someone had tried to save them all, and he had ignored her warning because he thought he knew better. 3 days later, Jake found himself back in Millbrook, his body still aching from the ordeal at Canyon Creek Bridge. The news of the stagecoach accident had spread quickly through the small town, and people gathered around him wherever he went, eager to hear the details of their miraculous survival. However, Jake felt no pride in the attention. The loss of the cattle contracts weighed heavily on his conscience, and he knew he would have to face Mr. Henderson soon to explain how his mission had failed. More importantly, he couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious young woman who had tried to save them all. Jake spent his first day back asking questions around town, trying to learn more about Sarah Miller, the woman who had lost her family in a similar bridge collapse. The more he learned about her story, the more ashamed he felt about dismissing her warning. Sarah Miller had indeed lost her parents and younger brother when their wagon fell through a weakened bridge during a flood. She had been the only survivor, pulled from the water by a passing rider who heard her cries for help. The tragedy had occurred just 6 weeks before Jake's encounter with her. She had been staying with distant relatives in Millbrook while trying to rebuild her shattered life. According to the townspeople Jake spoke with, Sarah had become obsessed With warning travelers about dangerous bridges and road conditions, many dismissed her as a traumatized young woman whose grief had affected her ability to think clearly. However, Jake now understood that her warnings came from genuine knowledge and a desperate desire to prevent others from experiencing the same tragedy she had endured. On his second day back in town, Jake learned from the local sheriff that Sarah had indeed reported the damage to Canyon Creek Bridge to the authorities. She had made 3 separate trips to the sheriff's office, providing detailed descriptions of the structural problems she had observed. Unfortunately, her reports had been filed away without investigation, dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken woman. The irony was devastating. Sarah Miller had been the only person who truly understood the danger, and she had tried everything in her power to prevent the disaster. The authorities, the Stagecoach company, and passengers like Jake had all ignored her warnings because they didn't take her seriously. Jake knew he had to find Sarah and apologize for not believing her. More than that, he wanted to thank her for trying to save them, even though her efforts had been dismissed and ignored. He spent hours walking through Millbrook and the surrounding area, asking everyone he met if they had seen the young woman with auburn hair and green eyes. Finally, on the afternoon of his 3rd day back, Jake found her. Sarah was sitting beside a small creek outside of town, staring at the flowing water with an expression of profound sadness. She looked even more fragile than he remembered, as if the weight of knowing that her warnings had been ignored was crushing her spirit. Jake approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When she looked up and recognized him, her eyes filled with tears. "Survived," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle sound of the creek. "When I heard about the accident, I was so afraid that everyone had died because I couldn't make you listen." Jake knelt beside her, his own eyes beginning to fill with emotion. "Miss Miller, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express. You tried to save our lives, and I dismissed your warning."
How?
"I'm so sorry." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I knew what was going to happen. I had checked that bridge myself just 2 days before. Storm damage was obvious to anyone who looked closely, but nobody would believe me." "Why didn't you tell me about your family when you warned me?" Jake asked gently. "I had known about your experience. I might have listened more carefully. Because every time I mentioned what happened to my family, people assumed I was just a hysterical woman seeing dangers that didn't exist," Sarah replied. "I thought if I could warn you without mentioning my personal tragedy, you might take the warning seriously based on the facts alone." Jake felt his heart break as he realized the impossible position she had been in. Sarah had tried to save them using logic and factual observations. But without her personal story to provide credibility, her warnings seemed like unfounded fears. Yet when she did mention her family's tragedy, people dismissed her as emotionally unstable. "The sheriff told me that you reported the bridge damage 3 times, Jake said. "You did everything you could possibly do to prevent this accident." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "You spoke to Sheriff Williams." "I wanted to understand what really happened, and I wanted to find you to apologize," Jake explained. "Also, wanted to thank you for trying to save us, even though we didn't deserve your help after the way you were treated." For the first time since Jake had met her, Sarah smiled slightly. It was a sad smile, but it showed a glimmer of the person she might have been before tragedy changed her life. "I'm glad you survived," she said quietly. "All of you. When I heard that old Pete managed to get the stagecoach across and that nobody died, I felt like maybe my family's death wasn't completely meaningless. Maybe their tragedy helped me save other lives." Jake spent the next hour sitting with Sarah by the creek, listening to her story and sharing the details of their survival. He learned that she had been traveling the roads constantly since her family's death, checking bridges and road conditions, trying to identify dangerous situations before they could claim more lives. When Jake finally stood to leave, he made a promise that would change both of their lives. "Miss Miller, I want to help you. Your knowledge could save many more lives, but you need someone who people will listen to. Would you allow me to work with you to make sure the authorities take your warnings seriously?" Sarah looked up at him with hope flickering in her green eyes for the first time since he had met her. "You would do that, even though helping me might hurt your reputation in town?" Jake thought about the cattle contracts lying at the bottom of Canyon Creek, about the ranch families who would suffer because of his failed mission, and about the 5 people who had nearly died because he had ignored the warning of someone. Who knew better than anyone else how dangerous damaged bridges could be? "Miss Miller," he said firmly, "helping you is the most important thing I can do. We're going to make sure that what happened to your family and what nearly happened to us never happens to anyone else." As Jake walked back to Wardtown, he realized that losing the contracts and failing his mission to Silver Creek had led him to something far more important. He had found his true purpose, and it was standing beside a young woman who had tried to save the world, one warning at a time.